When you've got something as bland and undetailed as we've got a water problem, it doesn't come close to getting us where we need to be to start this particular conversation. Because depending on where in the world you're talking about, there are many places where there's too much, many places where there'll never be enough. At the same time, with both of those challenges, for vast, almost unimaginable consequences for people entering those futures, because the models are not sturdy. The trajectory of these problems are not predictable. How do we prepare in a way that answers the challenges of Amman, Jordan, and Kano State in northern Nigeria at one end of the continuum, and Mumbai, Miami, and this densely packed collection of capital, New York, where we're sitting at the moment? Luckily, we have the people with the answers and 25 brisk minutes to elicit them all. To get us started, there are places in the world that have taken the measure of the challenge, put responses in place that make sense, gotten the public behind them. Are there leaders and laggards in this area? Jacqueline?
Great question and great framing. I guess one thing I'd comment on is that a very helpful way to think about these challenges can be around a framework to analyze what are the specific needs and challenges and what are the specific opportunities in a given place. My institute works a lot on integrated water management, and that really starts from the perspective that, at least here in the US, one of the very traditional ways of dealing with water has been incredibly siloed. So you have your potable water management system, which is very separate from your wastewater management, which is in turn separate from stormwater management. And if you step back and just think about the fact that water is water, whether it's dirty, clean, and you can really think holistically about that system. And then this framework gives you the chance to say, in our community, our biggest challenge is overall scarcity, overall deluge, or sometimes a good amount, but just it comes in bursts and it isn't kind of a steady natural supply that we experience. And also beyond kind of framing what are your biggest challenges, what are your biggest needs, what do you want to prioritize pursuing, bearing in mind all the stakeholders who are involved and affected by your water management. So that can bring in a vast group of people, including your watershed managers, so that you're conscious of your environmental impacts, right through to your end consumer. One of the great regions that has done a lot of work on this integrated water management is Australia. They've shown a lot of success. US water managers are noting that, and many of them are getting very involved.
Kate?
Well, you're talking about types of water. I think one example that's often used when talking about kind of coastal threats is Holland or the Netherlands. But what I wanted to emphasize is the politics and the decision-making frameworks of all of these places relative to how effective managers can be. Holland's example is that, in response to massive flooding, well, of course, this is a country that is below sea level. There's a lot of kind of shared racial or ethnic background within this country. They were developed with a kind of series of water boards, so literally their governance was sort of structured around the issue of water. And they've moved into a kind of through different paradigms. The first one was aggressively keeping water out, and now Holland is starting to move towards this paradigm of living with water, actually undoing some of the major locks and dams they built, trying to build with nature in terms of sand dunes and so on. But I guess I would just contrast that management regime with many of the other places that I've visited in the world and that you referenced in your remarks, like Mumbai, or places that around the world that are facing threats within that same spectrum, maybe not as existential threats, but have incredibly different governance structures. And I think that to me is going to be really where we need to start to focus our energy, our design energy, in some of these places that are incredibly threatened, but also maybe have less capital or social kind of cohesion or governance structures to enable these decisions to be made.
And finally, Seth, you've been looking more at scarcity than too much.
Yeah, I'd like to just reflect one way for the audience, and that is to say that that water is a very vast subject, and therefore you can be looking at it as the water we need to live our lives, drinking, cooking, sanitation, bathing. You can be looking at it as water for agriculture. You can be looking at water as a threat, rising sea levels, falling amounts of water in groundwater. You can be looking at it from many different ways, and I think it's very important for us to define our terms at all points as to what we're talking about, because otherwise water becomes sort of this just out there UFO that's hovering over us, and we don't really know where and how to deal with it. And just a quick comment about Kate's insight that I wanted to just share, which is that the book I wrote, Let There Be Water, and I'm working on another one now, which maybe we can get into later, but the book I wrote, it talks about how in the driest region of the world, in a place with fast-growing population, a country has figured out a way to have an abundance of water. The country is Israel. And I believe that the way that it's succeeded, aside from very smart uses of market forces and great amounts of technology, is the governance structure that we talked about. And that is to understand that frequently water is screwed up by politicians and by being involved in the political process, and that because water is so politicized, there are winners and losers, and politics is the allocation of resources, which makes some people better and some people worse off. What Israel made the decision to do was to completely take the water decision-making out of the hands of politicians. And there's a water authority that sits for a 5-year term and with a permanent staff, and everyone there is a technocrat and completely divorced from politics. And I think that that is probably the great secret as to why they've been the success that they have.
One of the things that's tantalizing about this subject, and if you remember the myth of Tantalus, it'll work out as a metaphor, is that you're not trying to hit a stable target. The confidence that the civil engineers of a century ago brought into planning big things that would be online for a long time is no longer as easily present as people get together to talk about how to do big things. We don't know in a certain kind of way what's the situation's going to be in 2030, 2040 during the useful life of the things that we're planning today, and whether it's increasing over-reliance on irrigation water to replace rainfall, incursion of brackish water into arable land because of rising ocean levels, privatization of water supply by cash-strapped governments that can't keep up with the enormous challenges of population growth. Are there just basic social equity questions that are exposed by having to grapple with something like this? Sure, there's water, if you can afford it.
I was just going to extend that and maybe build on that prior comment. That so in addition to being a founder of Scape, which is a landscape architecture firm, I'm the associate professor at Columbia. And over many, many years, I've taken students to cities around the world with water at the center, kind of looking at cities through the lens of water. And what you're, this sort of reference to brackish water. And I think what I wanted to emphasize is the interconnectedness of water. And yes, you have to break it down, but you kind of can't, because the way, one example is Calcutta in Vietnam, okay? So we have a situation where you have the water, energy, food nexus kind of coming into play. We have increasing number of dams being built on the Mekong upstream. And what's happening is you have salinization happening, so rice farmers, flying off the land, urbanization, and literally you're kind of seeing, it's hard to undo the world, but I think what's important in water is to really try to connect all those dots between rapid urbanization, agriculture, salinization, sea level rise, and literally the kind of the energy loop that we're in, because these dams are being made for hydropower, but they're actually cutting off fish stocks, which are affecting food and creating salinization. So I guess increasingly in cities that we visited around the world, you can begin to see the what I don't know if you call it the downward spiral, but the interconnectedness and collapse of the water cycle in a much broader sense of the picture that you just described.
Seth and Jackie?
Ray, I think you make actually a profoundly important point in the question you ask. And that is that I really want to put a bright light around it for the audience in case it slipped by. And that is that for much of what we talk about with water, it is the idea of the fixed target problem is pervasive. So if you're talking about installing drip irrigation in a field somewhere in Karnataka in India, okay, so if you can adjust the flow and you can tear it out and it's not a great big cost. But if you look at the civil infrastructure for the water that we live, whether it's, and the book I mentioned earlier that I'm working on is now about America's drinking water and frankly, the lamentable quality of it. And the reason for that is the fact that we built out systems from the 1880s mostly through called the post-World War II era. And we built out this really wonderful system that addressed all the problems for then and the scientific insights for then. And now we're facing a whole new world where we're going to be living with our new civil infrastructure that's going to be replacing what was. We're going to be living with it for 50 years, 75 years, maybe 100 years. And we don't really understand. Now what we understand is that the threats are coming at us fast and furious, but we don't really know what those threats are going to be. And therefore, we need to be able to figure out a way, maybe with great organizations like your work and your organization, to figure out ways of what those threats might be and how we can make the systems resilient enough that they could be responsive to those threats that are coming at us.
Jackie?
Resilience is absolutely a key term in terms of your comment on timeline and projections. A notable example in this space is City of Austin in Texas, which has just put together a 100-year water plan. And I see them, as well as other cities, really thinking about what's the mix of centralized versus decentralized infrastructure. What are the district-level solutions? What are the building-level solutions? You've got places like San Francisco and Minneapolis where they've really driven hard on what can we do at the building level? How do we enable those small-scale systems to contribute to our water management challenges and solutions? And I think that's potentially a really useful approach to consider.
Is there a point, could you even conceive of a point, where we just say to a Henderson County, Nevada, you're kind of done. Don't take on another 1 million people. You don't have water for them.
You do see cities making decisions. We work with another small but rapidly growing city, New Braunfels in Texas, and they have actually looked at certain businesses that want to come to town, realized how high their water consumption is, and said, sorry, but we just don't see this working. And so you are seeing that kind of supply question and consumption question factoring into that kind of decision making.
As Americans are pretty allergic to that kind of heavy-handed message.
Can I say a word about that? Actually, I'm opposed to any authoritarian solution to our water problems. I'm opposed to population control. I'm opposed to prohibiting consumption of beef. I'm opposed to any things that get floated around, all those types of things. Opposed to banning new people moving into areas. I'm opposed to any of those things. The problem we have, particularly in the United States, but the problem we have is that we don't use market forces to make our judgments. On every other decision about our lives, how we buy our cars, how we take our vacations, where we live, market forces either influence or determine for us what we're going to do. In water, because it's so incredibly subsidized, and because there's such a disconnect between the real cost of water and I'm talking about the environmental cost, the real actual economic cost of that water, because there's such a huge disconnect with that, that communities like Henderson, Nevada, are permitted to grow at a pace where they're not paying the real cost for their water. And if they had to do that, then I would say, bring them on. Not 1 million, 10 million, as many as you want. As many as you can squeeze in there, go for it. Your own zoning rules, good luck. But don't ask others to subsidize your water consumption and your food choices and your family size. Everyone should pay their real rate. Obviously, poor people should be subsidized, like we do with subsidized food. But everyone who can afford to pay should be paying, and let market forces help shape the answer. And I think that's a key part that's out of the equation because, again, politics plays too large of a part in our water decision making.
Well, when you take students to some of these real pressure points in the world, when you take it out of the classroom and go see what's really happening in Rio, in Calcutta, in Amman, what do your students make of it? It's so removed from the experience that I'm going to guess many of them have grown up with.
It's a tremendous learning experience, and it's also incredibly helpful to do this comparative study. So one year we did take students to Amman, Jordan, and Calcutta, India, which actually kind of mirrors the topic of this panel of surge and scarcity. And literally the students within 4 days drew the water infrastructure and vulnerability of Amman's drinking water crisis, which is very politically partly in its origin relative to the channeling and the discrepancy and conflict over the Jordan River, another group was halfway around the world looking at surge and looking at the challenges of Calcutta, I will say one landscape and that was particularly inspiring to the students was the East Calcutta Wetlands. And this is what I would call like an integrated landscape approach. I mean, people talk about technology or market fixes for water. I'm going to be someone who's going to talk about landscape strategies for water, forests, wetlands, etc. But the East Calcutta Wetlands is literally a large zone of wetlands that essentially helps to filter the sewer water from urban water from Calcutta in a series of interconnected pools where vegetables are grown, where fish are cultivated, and that then feeds back into the city. So I think, I hate to talk about quick technology fixes for water because I think that's the opposite of what we need to do. I think we need to think at landscape scales. I think we need to invest in forests and wetlands. But this is an example of one landscape that I think students got extremely excited about because it's embedded in people's lives. It involved a production of, food and integrated water into agriculture, into all other kinds of, living and livelihoods. So people cared about it and sustained it.
We'll have time to take a couple of your questions in a moment, so be thinking of something that's elegant, brief, and actually a question. As you look down the road, is there inevitably going to be a lot of places in the world where this is going to have to be done with a gun to our head because the prudent decisions are not being made now in advance of us welcoming the 9 billionth person on the planet who has to be fed, who needs clean water to drink, to wash?
So the answer is I really hope not. The reason why I stepped out of my life, the reason I left my business career about 9-10 years ago was exactly to respond to that question. I didn't see the issues everyone here is thinking about, but I saw water scarcity as a growing problem in large parts of the world. I saw that we could see huge humanitarian crisis and population flows before I knew about immigration crises, like what happened with the Syrian civil war and all that stuff. And I thought to myself, we really need to start thinking about solutions here. So my answer is that my book, the one I mentioned earlier, Let There Be Water, is actually an optimistic book because it shows that there are real-world solutions, whether you're a poor country or a rich country, whether you're a landlocked country or a country with a long seacoast, you have the opportunity to have very smart outcomes that will not lead you to the door of destitution and poverty and horror. On the other hand, although it is an optimistic book because we know there is a solution, and I show how it would work, the problem is that there is such bad governance in so many places, and because water problems are a proxy for bad governance, that you're going to see, I think, lots of places where there will be a crisis, a horrible crisis that's going to come because by the time they realize they have to do something, it's going to be too late to move, and you're going to end up spending multiples of what you had to spend, and there won't be the cash available to do it. So I think that the wealthier countries can always buy their way out of the problem, but I think in lots of places around the world, we're going to be seeing some very, very horrible outcomes coming very soon.
Jacqueline?
I'll be totally honest and say that unfortunately we can't talk about these crises entirely in the future. We've had many problems in the past and some very recently here in Flint, Michigan. I know we're talking about that later this morning, where we've just seen incredibly inadequate responses, short spans of attention to a crisis, and then we move on to whatever the next problem is in the media. So unfortunately, we're already seeing many challenges. Similarly to Seth, what gets me out of bed every morning is trying to minimize the number of places that experience severe challenges. And I just feel part of my job is not just to go and do research and help people on the ground, but also to be out here communicating to everybody I know, including my friends who just turn on the faucet in the morning and brush their teeth without even thinking twice about everything that has to happen for potable water to be reliably coming out of their faucet in the morning. So I just believe that similarly to our energy challenges, we all have to spend as much of our thoughtful energy around, what do we do, what can we each individually bring to making sure other people understand this is a challenge, make sure we're working towards solutions.
There are roving mics, one there, and a questioner.
Yes, hello. My name is Terry Mendelson. I'm from True Cost Environmental Analytics, and I'd be interested in hearing from the panelists about innovation or technology that they're excited about that addresses issues of water quality and quantity.
Kate?
This isn't going to be what you're looking for, but I'm going to say forests. And I'm going to give you an example. And that is for example, I was in Maputo, Mozambique with WWF, one of the underwriters of this event. And we were looking at, when you talk about resilience, much more broadly at the scale of Mozambique, the challenges of water and extraction landscapes. And Maputo's entire drinking water is dependent on a forest that is mostly in Swaziland, and that forest is rapidly being deforested. So there is the pipe, the dreaded pipe, which, and there is this sort of means of transport, but that entire infrastructure, that hard infrastructure, is completely dependent upon an intact landscape that is functional. And so, you know, I would, you know, as much as I would love to say there's a special, you know, pill that you can put in and everything's clean, I actually feel like we need to invest in these larger ecosystemic preservation projects, and that will help, you know, preserve our groundwater and help kind of preserve this interconnectedness and biodiversity that we need to actually keep fresh water circulating in the world. But that's probably a different answer than.
I'll just, by the way, I want to second that. I would not have ever thought to say that, but I'm so glad that you said it, so that now I will now steal that answer from now on, because I get asked that. I get asked that question a lot. So now I'm gonna, without any credit to you, perhaps I'll just start using it. But I was in Sao Paulo recently, and as you may know, they had a horrific water crisis there. Basically, electricity was shut off of the city. It's a major world city, and the reason is they figured out was because they had been clearing the Brazilian rainforests, and the trees hundreds of miles away created this canopy of this river of water, this vapor that ended up descending onto Sao Paulo, and because they managed to clear cut so much of the forest, they left us. But to answer your question with, I think, what you meant by that, but I do love that answer. There are two technologies, one that's real and the other one which is fanciful. You're going to be hearing about the fanciful one later today. I saw the schedule. The one that's real is drip irrigation. I am a complete zealot about drip irrigation. I can't say enough great things about drip irrigation. It saves enormous amounts of water. It saves also on the degradation of soil and the degradation of water supply, because you can also feed the fertilizer and nutrients through the drip irrigation process, and therefore not have all the terrible nitrogen runoffs. So I just in the interest of time, I won't say a lot more, but just drip irrigation is adopted in a tiny fraction of the worldwide irrigated fields, and we need to do more about that. India, by the way, is, God bless them, leading the charge on that, because they understand how important that is. The fanciful technology is this atmospheric water generation, which I think is a speaker one or two panels from now. And it's still not proven. It's still somewhat energy intensive. But if it can come to the fore, it will just change civilization. Everybody will put one of these atmospheric generators on their roof of their houses, and overnight, when it's moist in the air, it'll absorb all this fresh, pure water, and by the morning, you'll have a tank full of water that is perfect.
I'm just going to talk about a set of technologies that enable various forms of reuse. So many of us irrigate our lawns at home with potable water. Why do we do that? We were talking last night, the way concrete is formulated relies on potable water. Why? So all those approaches that enable treatment and reuse, I think, can really be helpful to us as we think about different ways of managing our water.
And the tyranny of the clock is forcing me to ring this down. Unfortunately, we could go for another half hour. There's a lot more I want to ask you all. But please
Let's do it anyway. We got the microphone.
That's true. Well, that's another kind of tyranny.
It's going to take us off.
Thanks a lot, Seth Levine, author of Let There Be Water, Kate Orff, architect and founder of SCAPE, and Jacqueline Ashmore, executive director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.